Marcus Chen had everything money could buy, yet he felt emptier than the day he'd started his first business 25 years ago. Standing in his penthouse office overlooking the glittering city skyline, he watched ordinary people hurry along, the sidewalks below like ants following invisible trails. These were the people who bought his products, worked in his factories, and made his empire possible. But Marcus realized he knew nothing about their actual lives. The 48-year-old tech mogul had built his fortune creating software that connected millions of people worldwide, yet he felt completely disconnected from the world around him. His days were filled with board meetings, investment calls, and charity galas where wealthy people wrote checks to feel better about their privilege. Everyone who surrounded him wanted something: his money, his influence, his endorsement. Nobody seemed to see Marcus the person anymore, just Marcus the billionaire. The breaking point came during a company presentation about their latest consumer research. Charts and graphs showed declining customer satisfaction, increasing complaints about working conditions, and growing public skepticism about big tech companies. The marketing team suggested a public relations campaign to improve their image, but Marcus felt sick listening to their polished proposals. They were talking about real people's lives as if they were just numbers on a spreadsheet. That evening, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He called his most trusted friend and business partner, Sarah Martinez, who had been with him since the early startup days when they worked out of a cramped garage. Sarah was one of the few people who remembered who Marcus was before the money, and fame transformed him into someone he barely recognized. Marcus explained his plan during a private dinner at an exclusive restaurant where they wouldn't be overheard. He wanted to go undercover, to live and work among ordinary people for 6 months. He would create a false identity, get a regular job, and experience life the way his customers and employees actually lived it. Sarah thought he had lost his mind, but she could see the desperation in his eyes. Creating the fake identity proved easier than expected. Marcus had enough connections to arrange convincing documentation, and he had always been good at blending into crowds when he wanted to avoid recognition. He chose the name David Miller, gave himself a background as a recently divorced office worker from another state, and rented a modest apartment in a middle-class neighborhood across town. The physical transformation surprised him. Without his expensive suits, professional styling, and confident billionaire posture, Marcus looked remarkably ordinary. He was average height with graying brown hair and kind eyes that people often overlooked in boardrooms. In thrift store clothes and cheap glasses, he became invisible in the way wealthy people never are. His first challenge was finding employment. Marcus had never actually applied for a regular job in his adult life. His resume as David Miller showed basic computer skills and general office experience. Nothing that would raise suspicions. After dozens of applications and several awkward interviews where he had to remember not to display his extensive business knowledge, he finally got hired as a customer service representative at a mid-sized insurance company. The job paid barely, enough to cover his modest apartment rent and basic expenses. For the first time in decades, Marcus had to budget for groceries and worry about utility bills. The apartment was tiny compared to his mansion, with thin walls that let him hear his neighbors' conversations, crying babies, and television shows. Initially, these sounds annoyed him, but gradually he began to recognize the rhythms of different families' lives. His co-workers at the insurance company were nothing like the polished executives and ambitious entrepreneurs he usually encountered. These were people with real problems, working hard to support their families and pay their bills. They worried about their children's education, their parents' medical expenses, and whether they could afford small luxuries like dinner out or new shoes. Their concerns seemed both foreign and strangely familiar to Marcus, reminding him of his own childhood before his family achieved financial stability. The customer service job itself was eye-opening in ways Marcus hadn't expected. Every day he fielded calls from people dealing with medical emergencies, car accidents, house fires, and other disasters. He heard the desperation in their voices when insurance claims were denied or delayed. These weren't abstract policy numbers. They were real people facing genuine crises, often made worse by bureaucratic complications and corporate indifference. One particular call stayed with him for days. An elderly woman named Grace had been fighting for months to get coverage for her husband's cancer treatments. She called the company daily, Always polite but increasingly frantic as medical bills piled up. Marcus found himself staying late to research her case, using skills he'd learned as a businessman to navigate the company's complex approval processes. When he finally got her claim approved, Grace cried with relief over the phone. That night, Marcus sat in his small apartment eating a microwave dinner and realized something fundamental had shifted inside him. For years, he had made decisions that affected thousands of people without really understanding the human impact of those choices. Now he was beginning to see how corporate policies translated into real human suffering or relief. His neighbors gradually began to accept him as David Miller, the quiet guy from apartment 4B. Mrs. Rodriguez from next door started inviting him to share dinner occasionally, worried that he seemed lonely. Her teenage son helped him figure out the building's temperamental laundry machines. The young couple upstairs included him in their weekend barbecues on the building's tiny roof deck. These simple interactions revealed a sense of community that Marcus had forgotten existed. In his wealthy circles, relationships were often transactional, based on mutual benefit or social status. But his neighbors helped each other simply because they were neighbors. They borrowed sugar, watched each other's children, and checked on elderly residents without expecting anything in return. As weeks passed, Marcus found himself genuinely caring about his co-workers' problems and celebrating their small victories. When his colleague Janet got a promotion that came with a modest raise, her joy was infectious. When Tom's daughter graduated from college, the whole office celebrated as if she were their own family member. These people found meaning and happiness in things that Marcus had taken for granted or dismissed as insignificant. The most surprising discovery was how much he enjoyed the simplicity of his new life. Without the constant pressure of major business decisions, endless meetings, and public scrutiny, Marcus felt more relaxed than he had in years. His days had clear boundaries. He worked his shift, came home, and had time to think, read, or simply sit quietly without the weight of enormous responsibilities crushing down on him. 3 months into his undercover experiment, Marcus had settled into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. He woke up each morning in his small apartment, made coffee in a machine that cost less than what he used to spend on a single business lunch, and walked to work instead of being driven in a luxury car. The 20-minute walk through his neighborhood had become one of his favorite parts of the day, watching children wait for school buses and shopkeepers opening their stores. At the insurance company, Marcus had become known as David, the helpful guy who actually listened to customers and worked hard to solve their problems. His supervisor, Linda, had noticed his dedication and pulled him aside one afternoon to commend his work. She mentioned that customer satisfaction scores had improved in their department, and several people had specifically requested to speak with him again when calling back. The praise meant more to Marcus than any business award he had ever received. These were real people whose lives he had made slightly easier, not shareholders impressed by profit margins. He began to understand that his previous definition of success had been incredibly narrow, focused only on wealth accumulation and market dominance, rather than actual human impact. His relationship with his neighbors continued to deepen in unexpected ways. Mrs. Rodriguez had become like a protective mother figure, often knocking on his door with extra food or inviting him to watch telenovelas with her. Her concern was genuine and unconditional, unlike the calculated kindness he received from people who wanted business favors. When he mentioned feeling under the weather one day, she appeared at his door with homemade soup and insisted on checking his temperature. The young couple upstairs, Mike and Lisa, had included him in their circle of friends who gathered for weekend movies or backyard barbecues. Marcus found himself looking forward to these simple social gatherings more than the exclusive galas and networking events that used to fill his calendar. These friends talked about their dreams, their struggles with student loans, their hopes for starting families, and their fears about job security. Their conversations were honest and vulnerable in ways that business discussions never were. Through Mike, Marcus learned about the gig economy that so many people now depended on for survival. Mike drove for a rideshare company on weekends to supplement his income from his day job at a retail store. He explained how the app algorithms worked, how surge pricing affected his earnings, and how he had to maintain his own car without any company support for repairs or insurance. Marcus realized that companies like his own had created systems that transferred traditional employment risks from corporations to individual workers. Lisa worked 2 part-time jobs because neither offered full-time positions with benefits. She spent mornings at a coffee shop and evenings doing data entry from home. Despite working nearly 60 hours a week, she barely earned enough to cover her share of rent and expenses. Her dream was to go back to school for nursing, but the cost seemed impossible on her current income. Marcus found himself wanting to help her, but knowing that David Miller couldn't afford to pay for someone else's education. The financial stress that his neighbors lived with daily began to weigh on Marcus in ways he hadn't expected. He had to carefully plan grocery shopping, choosing generic brands and watching for sales. When his cheap apartment's heating system broke during a cold snap, he couldn't simply call someone to fix it immediately. He had to wait for the landlord to address the problem, spending several uncomfortable nights bundled in blankets while trying to sleep. These experiences gave him a completely different perspective on customer service interactions at work. When people called about delayed payments or claim denials, he now understood the real anxiety behind their frustration. A denied claim might mean choosing between rent and medical care. A delayed payment could result in late fees that snowballed into larger financial problems. The corporate policies that seemed reasonable in boardroom discussions created genuine hardship for real families. Marcus started paying closer attention to the company's internal operations and decision-making processes. During team meetings, supervisors would discuss ways to reduce claim payouts and increase processing times to improve quarterly profits. They talked about customer complaints as problems to be managed, rather than symptoms of systemic issues that needed addressing. The disconnect between corporate priorities and customer needs reminded him uncomfortably of his own company's culture. One afternoon, Marcus overheard a conversation between 2 managers discussing a new policy that would require additional documentation for certain types of claims. They knew this would create barriers for customers and likely result in some people giving up on legitimate claims, but they justified it as necessary for fraud prevention. Marcus recognized the logic. He had approved similar policies in his own companies, but now he could imagine Grace, the elderly woman with the sick husband, struggling to navigate these new requirements. The weight of this realization hit him during a particularly difficult customer call. A single mother was crying as she explained that her son's emergency room visit had been denied coverage because she went to the wrong hospital during a medical crisis. The policy technically supported the denial, but Marcus could hear the desperation in her voice as she described having to choose between feeding her family and paying the medical bill. He spent his lunch break researching her case and found a technicality that allowed him to get the claim approved. But the victory felt hollow when he realized how many similar cases probably slipped through the cracks. His weekend conversations with neighbors took on new meaning as he began to see patterns in their struggles. Multiple families were dealing with medical debt that seemed impossible to pay off. Several people worked multiple jobs but still couldn't afford basic necessities like dental care or car repairs. Parents made sacrifices so their children could participate in school activities, often going without things they needed themselves. The American dream that Marcus had achieved seemed increasingly out of reach for the people working just as hard as he ever had. The most painful insight came when he realized how many of his neighbors' problems were directly connected to decisions made by people like his former self. Corporate policies designed to maximize shareholder value created the job insecurity, benefit gaps, and financial stress that defined their daily lives. The gig economy that exploited workers like Mike, the part-time employment strategy that denied benefits to people like Lisa, the insurance practices that created barriers for people seeking legitimate coverage. These weren't natural phenomena, but deliberate business strategies implemented by executives in boardrooms, far removed from their consequences. Marcus began researching his own company's employment practices and discovered uncomfortable truths about how his success had been built. Many of his manufacturing contracts went to companies that paid workers minimal wages without benefits. His software platforms collected and monetized user data in ways that most customers didn't fully understand. The stock buybacks and dividend payments that made him wealthy came at the expense of employee raises and facility improvements that workers had requested for years. Sleep became difficult as these realizations accumulated. Marcus would lie in his narrow bed, listening to his neighbor's baby crying through the thin walls, thinking about all the decisions he had made that prioritized profit over people. He had always told himself that business was business, that market forces would naturally create the best outcomes for everyone. Now he was living among the people who bore the costs of those market forces, and their struggles had faces, names, and stories that haunted him. The transformation wasn't just intellectual, but emotional. Marcus found himself genuinely angry at corporate executives who seemed indifferent to their workers' welfare. He felt protective of his neighbors and co-workers in ways that surprised him. When Linda mentioned that the company was considering layoffs to improve quarterly numbers, Marcus wanted to argue against the decision, forgetting momentarily that David Miller was just a customer service representative whose opinion wouldn't matter to corporate leadership. The fourth month of Marcus's experiment brought a crisis that would test everything he was learning about life outside the billionaire bubble. His co-worker Janet, the single mother who had been so excited about her small promotion, received devastating news. Her 8-year-old daughter Emma had been diagnosed with a rare form of childhood cancer that required immediate and expensive treatment. Marcus watched Janet struggle with impossible choices that no parent should have to face. The insurance company's health plan covered basic treatment, but the specialized therapy Emma needed was considered experimental and wasn't approved. Janet would have to pay out of pocket for treatment that cost more than she earned in 3 years, or watch her daughter receive less effective care with lower survival rates. The office rallied around Janet in ways that moved Marcus deeply. His co-workers organized bake sales, car washes, and garage sales to raise money for Emma's treatment. They donated their sick days to Janet so she could take time off without losing pay. Linda, their supervisor, quietly approved overtime shifts for anyone who wanted to earn extra money to contribute to Emma's medical fund. These were people who had very little themselves, yet they gave generously to help their colleague's child. Marcus found himself in an impossible position. As David Miller, customer service representative, he could contribute small amounts like his coworkers. But as Marcus Chen, billionaire, he could pay for Emma's entire treatment without noticing the expense. The ethical dilemma kept him awake at night. How could he watch a child suffer when he had the power to help? But revealing his true identity would end his experiment and potentially put Emma's family in an uncomfortable situation. He tried to find middle ground by researching Emma's condition and treatment options, using his business connections discreetly to gather information. Through a series of carefully orchestrated anonymous donations channeled through various charities and foundations, Marcus managed to contribute significantly to Emma's medical fund without revealing his identity. He told his co-workers that he had contacted some wealthy friends who wanted to help, which wasn't entirely untrue. The experience with Emma's illness opened Marcus's eyes to the brutal reality of medical costs in America. Even families with insurance faced financial ruin when serious illness struck. He spent hours on the phone helping customers navigate similar situations and began to understand how medical bankruptcy had become so common. The insurance company's policies, that seemed reasonable, from a business perspective, created life or death situations for real families. During this difficult time, Marcus's relationship with his neighbors deepened further. Mrs. Rodriguez became his confidant, someone he could talk to about the stress of watching Janet's family struggle. She shared her own experiences as an immigrant who had worked multiple jobs to support her children's education, never complaining about the sacrifices she made. Her resilience and dignity in the face of hardship impressed Marcus more than any business leader he had ever met. Mike and Lisa included him in their network of mutual support that extended throughout their social circle. When someone needed help moving, everyone showed up. When someone was between jobs, others shared job leads and offered temporary financial assistance. When someone's car broke down, they organized carpools and lent tools for repairs. This informal social safety net filled gaps that government, programs, and corporate benefits left empty. Through these relationships, Marcus began to understand how economic insecurity affected every aspect of people's lives. His neighbors made decisions based on immediate survival needs rather than long-term planning. They couldn't invest in education or career development because they needed every dollar for rent and food. They stayed in bad jobs because they couldn't afford to be unemployed while looking for better opportunities. They accumulated debt for emergencies that wealthier people could handle with savings. The stress of financial insecurity also took a toll on health and relationships. Marcus noticed that his coworkers got sick more often than his wealthy friends, partly because they couldn't afford preventive care, and partly because chronic stress weakened their immune systems. Marriages strained under financial pressure, and parents sacrificed their own needs for their children's welfare in ways that seemed heroic but unsustainable. Marcus started researching the broader economic trends that had created these conditions. He learned about wage stagnation, the decline of union membership, the shift from pensions to inadequate retirement savings plans, and the rising costs of healthcare, education, and housing that had outpaced income growth for decades. The policies and business practices he had always considered normal had systematically transferred wealth from working people to shareholders and executives like himself. The most disturbing discovery was how his own company had contributed to these problems. Marcus spent evenings reviewing financial reports and policy documents, seeing his business decisions through new eyes. The software his company developed had eliminated thousands of middle management jobs while increasing profits. The aggressive, tax avoidance strategies his accountants implemented reduced funding for public services that his neighbors depended on. The lobbying efforts his company supported opposed minimum wage increases and worker protection laws. Even his charitable giving, which had always made him feel virtuous, seemed inadequate and self-serving when viewed from his current perspective. The tax-deductible donations to prestigious cultural institutions and elite universities primarily benefited people who were already privileged. The charity galas he attended cost more to organize than many families earned in a year. His foundation's grants supported important causes, but they addressed symptoms rather than the systematic causes of inequality that his business practices helped create. Marcus began to understand that the problems his neighbors faced weren't individual failures, but structural issues created by policy choices that benefited wealthy people like himself. The gig economy that exploited workers like Mike existed because companies could avoid providing benefits and job security. The student debt that prevented people like Lisa from pursuing their dreams existed because public investment in education had been replaced by private lending that generated profits for financial institutions. The medical debt that threatened families like Janet's existed because healthcare had been treated as a commodity rather than a human right. This realization brought a growing sense of personal responsibility that Marcus found both overwhelming and motivating. He had always justified his wealth by claiming that successful businesses created jobs and economic growth that benefited everyone. But living among working people showed him that the benefits of economic growth had been captured almost entirely by shareholders and executives while the costs were borne by workers and communities. The psychological impact of these discoveries was profound. Marcus experienced something he had never felt before, genuine shame about his wealth and how he had acquired it. Not guilt about having money, but shame about the systematic exploitation that had made his fortune possible. He began to see his luxury lifestyle as evidence of other people's deprivation rather than his own success. Sleep became increasingly difficult as Marcus wrestled with the implications of what he was learning. He would lie awake thinking about Emma's medical bills, Janet's impossible choices, Mike's financial stress, Lisa's deferred dreams, and Mrs. Rodriguez's sacrifices. These weren't abstract social problems, but personal relationships that had changed his understanding of what wealth and success really meant. The contrast between his two lives became almost unbearable. During the day, he was David Miller, customer, service representative, earning barely enough to survive and genuinely concerned about his coworkers' welfare. At night, he was Marcus Chen, billionaire, whose investment accounts earned more in a single day than David Miller would make in years of hard work. The cognitive dissonance of this double existence was taking an emotional toll that Marcus hadn't anticipated when he began his experiment. As Emma began her treatment and showed early signs of improvement, Marcus felt relief mixed with renewed determination to understand the full scope of what he was discovering. The experience had shown him both the generosity and vulnerability of working people, and he knew he was only beginning to comprehend the implications of the wealth gap that separated his two identities. By the 5th month of his undercover life, Marcus had developed a routine that felt more authentic than anything he had experienced in years. He woke up each morning genuinely looking forward to his conversations with Mrs. Rodriguez over coffee, his work helping customers navigate insurance bureaucracy, and his evenings with Mike and Lisa discussing their hopes and concerns. But this growing attachment to his new life made the deception increasingly difficult to maintain. The psychological strain of living a double life was becoming overwhelming. Every genuine moment of connection with his neighbors and coworkers was shadowed by the knowledge that he was lying to them about his fundamental identity. When Mrs. Rodriguez worried about his financial security and offered to help him find additional work, Marcus felt sick knowing that he owned companies worth more than she could imagine. When Mike stressed about car repairs and asked if David could lend him $50, Marcus wanted to confess that $50 meant nothing to him but everything to Mike. The most painful moments came when his coworkers shared their dreams and frustrations, unknowingly talking to someone who had the power to change their circumstances, but couldn't reveal it. Lisa had started taking community college classes at night, slowly working toward her nursing degree while juggling 2 jobs. She calculated that it would take her 8 years to complete the program at her current pace, assuming no financial emergencies forced her to drop out. Marcus knew he could pay for her entire education with pocket change, but David Miller could only offer moral support. Janet's situation with Emma's medical treatment had improved thanks to the mysterious donations, but the stress had taken a visible toll on her health. She had lost weight, developed a persistent cough, and aged years in the span of months. Her insurance didn't cover mental health counseling to help her cope with the trauma of her daughter's diagnosis, so she carried the emotional burden alone while trying to maintain her work performance. Marcus watched her struggle and felt complicit in a system that treated healthcare as a privilege rather than a basic human need. The insurance company where Marcus worked was implementing new cost-cutting measures that directly affected his coworkers and customers. Management announced they would be eliminating several positions and increasing productivity requirements for remaining employees. Customer service representatives would be required to handle more calls per hour with less time to research complex cases. These changes would improve quarterly profit margins, but inevitably lead to worse outcomes for customers dealing with medical emergencies, accident claims, and other crises. Marcus found himself in increasingly uncomfortable situations where his knowledge of business operations conflicted with his role as David Miller. During team meetings, he wanted to point out the long-term costs of short-sighted policies, but customer service representatives weren't expected to understand strategic implications. He watched Linda struggle to implement directives she disagreed with, knowing that her job depended on following corporate mandates even when they harmed employees and customers. The announcement of layoffs created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty in the office that reminded Marcus of his own company's restructuring decisions. His coworkers worried about losing their jobs, their health insurance, and their ability to support their families. They began competing against each other for management's approval, damaging relationships that had provided mutual support during difficult times. The humanity that Marcus had discovered in this workplace was being systematically destroyed by corporate policies designed to maximize shareholder value. As rumors spread about which departments would be affected by layoffs, Marcus realized he might lose his job as David Miller before completing his 6-month experiment. The irony wasn't lost on him. He might experience unemployment and job insecurity firsthand, something he had never faced as a wealthy entrepreneur. The possibility terrified him in ways that business failures never had, because David Miller had no safety net, no savings, no wealthy connections to provide opportunities. His growing identification with his coworkers' struggles was changing Marcus's understanding of risk and success in fundamental ways. As a billionaire, he had always celebrated entrepreneurs who took bold risks to build businesses, but now he realized that the biggest risks were borne by employees who had no control over corporate decisions. When companies failed or restructured, workers lost jobs, healthcare, and financial security, while executives received severance packages and moved on to new opportunities. The mythology of entrepreneurial risk-taking ignored the reality of who actually suffered the consequences of business decisions. These insights led Marcus to research his own company's employment practices more thoroughly. He discovered that while his executive team received millions in compensation and benefits, many of the company's contract workers earned poverty wages, without health care, retirement contributions, or job security. The facilities overseas that manufactured his products operated under conditions that he had never personally investigated, despite knowing they were chosen primarily for their low labor costs. The most disturbing discovery came when Marcus found internal documents discussing strategies to classify more employees as independent contractors to avoid providing benefits. The legal and financial teams had calculated that fighting worker classification lawsuits would be cheaper than providing health care and retirement benefits to thousands of employees. These decisions were presented as necessary cost management, rather than deliberate choices to transfer risks and costs from the company to vulnerable workers. Marcus began to understand that his wealth wasn't just the result of innovation and hard work, but of systematic extraction of value from people who had no power to demand fair compensation. The software his company developed generated billions in revenue, but the programmers, designers, and support staff who created it received salaries that barely kept pace with cost of living increases. Meanwhile, shareholders and executives captured most of the value through stock appreciation and dividend payments. The realization that he had built his fortune through exploitation rather than creation was devastating. Marcus had always told himself that successful businesses benefited everyone by creating jobs and driving innovation. But living as David Miller showed him that the jobs his businesses created often trapped people in cycles of financial insecurity while generating enormous profits for investors. The innovation his companies produced solved problems for people who could afford their products while ignoring the needs of people who couldn't access them. This growing awareness of systematic exploitation extended beyond his own company to the broader economic system. Marcus began to see how wealth concentrated among a small elite while working people struggled to meet basic needs. The stock market, gains that had made him richer were often driven by corporate cost-cutting that harmed employees and communities. The tax policies that protected his wealth reduced funding for public services that his neighbors depended on for education, healthcare, and infrastructure. The psychological impact of these discoveries was profound and disorienting. Marcus experienced something he had never felt before, genuine class consciousness, but from the perspective of working people rather than wealthy elites. He began to identify more strongly with his co-workers than with his billionaire peers, seeing the world through their eyes rather than his own privileged perspective. This shift in identification was both liberating and terrifying, opening his heart to connections he had never experienced while simultaneously revealing the moral bankruptcy of his previous worldview. Sleep became almost impossible as Marcus wrestled with the implications of what he was learning. He would lie in his narrow bed, hearing his neighbors' conversations through thin walls, thinking about the vast resources he controlled that could solve their problems instantly. The weight of unused power to help people who had become genuinely important to him created a sense of moral urgency that he had never experienced in his business career. The contrast between his two identities was becoming unbearable. During the day, he was David Miller, worried about potential job loss and struggling to help customers navigate bureaucratic obstacles. At night, he was Marcus Chen, whose automated investment systems generated more wealth in a single trading session than David Miller could earn in decades. The cognitive dissonance was creating a psychological crisis that Marcus wasn't sure he could resolve without taking action that would fundamentally change both of his lives. As he entered the final month of his planned experiment, Marcus knew that returning to his previous life would be impossible. But he also knew that maintaining his current deception was becoming emotionally unsustainable. The truth he was uncovering was indeed too painful to bear, but it was also too important to ignore. The question was no longer what he had learned, but what he was prepared to do with knowledge that demanded fundamental changes to everything he had built his life around. The final month of Marcus's experiment began with news that shattered his carefully constructed world as David Miller. The insurance company announced that his department would be eliminated as part of a broader restructuring plan designed to improve efficiency and reduce costs. Marcus and 23 of his coworkers would lose their jobs in 30 days, just before the holidays, with minimal severance packages and the termination of their health insurance benefits. The announcement came during a mandatory meeting where corporate executives delivered the news via video conference from their headquarters in another state. They spoke in sanitized corporate language about market pressures, competitive challenges, and the need for operational excellence. They thanked the affected employees for their service and promised transition assistance that Marcus immediately recognized as inadequate. The executives had never met the people they were firing and showed no understanding of how their decisions would affect real families during the most expensive time of the year. Marcus watched his co-workers receive this devastating news with a mixture of shock, anger, and resigned acceptance that broke his heart. Linda, their supervisor, had tears in her eyes as she tried to maintain her composure while delivering additional details about the termination process. Janet looked physically ill, knowing that losing her job meant losing the health insurance that covered Emma's ongoing cancer treatment. Mike immediately started calculating how he would pay rent and support Lisa's education without his steady income. Even Mrs. Rodriguez, who worked in a different department that wasn't affected, seemed shaken by the reminder of how quickly economic security could disappear. The psychological impact on Marcus was immediate and overwhelming. For the first time in his adult life, he faced genuine job insecurity and financial anxiety. David Miller had no savings to fall back on, no wealthy connections to provide opportunities, no safety net beyond unemployment benefits that would cover only a fraction of his basic expenses. The terror of potential homelessness and hunger that he had never experienced as a billionaire hit him with physical force, causing panic attacks and insomnia that medication couldn't address. But even more devastating than his personal fear was watching people he genuinely cared about face circumstances that threatened their survival. Janet's quiet desperation as she researched COBRA insurance costs that would consume most of her severance pay. Mike's frantic job searching while trying to maintain his rideshare work and support Lisa's emotional breakdown when she realized she would have to drop out of school again. The elderly security guard who had planned to work 2 more years before retirement, but now faced an impossible job search at age 63. The deception that had once seemed like an interesting experiment now felt like a cruel betrayal of people who had welcomed David Miller into their lives with genuine affection and trust. Mrs. Rodriguez brought him homemade soup when she noticed he looked unwell, worrying about his job prospects and offering to speak with her employer about potential openings. Her kindness toward someone she believed to be struggling financially, while she had her own concerns, felt like a judgment on Marcus's moral character that he couldn't escape. Marcus found himself in an impossible ethical situation. He could reveal his identity and help his coworkers immediately, but doing so would expose them to media attention and potentially exploitation that could make their lives worse. Wealthy people discovering working-class struggles was a common news story that often treated real people's poverty as entertainment for affluent audiences. He could continue the deception and provide anonymous financial assistance, but that felt paternalistic and wouldn't address the systematic problems that created their vulnerability in the first place. The corporate machinery of termination proceeded with mechanical efficiency that demonstrated how completely workers were dehumanized by business processes Marcus had designed and implemented in his own companies. Employees were required to train their overseas replacements who would perform their jobs for a fraction of the cost. They had to return company property, surrender access badges, and sign non-disclosure agreements that prevented them from discussing their working conditions publicly. Their personal belongings were packed into boxes and escorted out of the building by security guards who treated dedicated employees like potential criminals. During his final weeks at the company, Marcus used his access to internal systems to research the decision-making process that had led to the layoffs. He discovered that the cost savings from eliminating his department would improve quarterly earnings per share by less than 2 cents. But those small improvements would trigger executive bonuses worth millions of dollars. The human cost of destroying 24 families' financial security was considered acceptable to generate stock price increases that would last only until the next earnings report. The most painful discovery came when Marcus found emails discussing the timing of the layoffs. Company executives had deliberately scheduled the terminations for December to minimize severance costs, knowing that finding new employment would be nearly impossible during the holiday season. They had calculated that desperate workers would accept lower wages when they eventually found jobs, reducing labor costs throughout the industry. The suffering they were creating wasn't an unfortunate side effect, but a deliberate strategy to increase corporate profits. These revelations forced Marcus to confront the reality that he had approved similar decisions countless times throughout his career. He had fired employees to improve quarterly results, relocated operations to reduce labor costs, and implemented efficiency measures that eliminated jobs without considering the human consequences. The abstract discussions in boardrooms had always focused on financial metrics rather than the families whose lives would be destroyed by cost-cutting strategies. The final week of employment was emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Co-workers who had supported each other through personal crises were now competing for the few available positions in other departments. The mutual aid network that had helped Janet with Emma's medical expenses was being destroyed as everyone focused on their own survival needs. The community that Marcus had come to love was being systematically dismantled by corporate decisions made by people who would never face the consequences of their choices. Marcus spent his final days at work, helping customers who had no idea. Their cases would soon be transferred to overseas call centers where representatives would have less training, less authority to solve problems, and less understanding of American healthcare and legal systems. He listened to elderly people struggling with Medicare claims, accident victims fighting for coverage, and small business owners trying to protect their employees' benefits. Each call reminded him that corporate efficiency improvements often meant worse outcomes for vulnerable people who depended on these services during their most difficult moments. The goodbye party that his co-workers organized was both touching and heartbreaking. They pooled their limited resources to buy a cake and small gifts for everyone, maintaining traditions of mutual care, even as their economic foundation was being destroyed. People shared contact information and promised to help each other find new opportunities, though everyone knew how difficult that would be in a job market where similar positions were disappearing throughout the industry. Linda, their supervisor, pulled Marcus aside during the party to tell him how much she had appreciated his dedication and customer service skills. She mentioned that several customers had specifically requested to work with him again, and that his compassionate approach had made a real difference in people's lives during their most stressful moments. Her recognition meant more to Marcus than any business achievement he had ever accomplished, because it represented genuine value he had created for real people, rather than abstract financial metrics. As Marcus cleaned out his desk on his final day, he found thank you notes from customers whose claims he had helped resolve. Grace, the elderly woman whose husband's cancer treatment he had gotten approved, had sent a handwritten card expressing gratitude for his patience and persistence. A young father had written to thank him for expediting coverage for his daughter's emergency surgery. These tangible reminders of human impact contrasted sharply with the corporate evaluation systems that measured success only in terms of call volume and processing speed. The transition from David Miller, employed customer service, representative, to David Miller, unemployed job seeker, was psychologically devastating in ways Marcus hadn't anticipated. The daily structure and sense of purpose that work had provided disappeared overnight, replaced by the grinding anxiety of job searching while facing imminent financial crisis. He experienced the depression and loss of self-worth that chronic unemployment created, understanding for the first time why joblessness affected mental health so profoundly. Marcus's severance pay would last exactly 6 weeks if he maintained his current modest lifestyle, and unemployment benefits would replace only a fraction of his lost income. He found himself making the same impossible calculations that millions of Americans faced regularly: whether to pay rent or buy groceries, whether to maintain health insurance or keep the heat on, whether to use credit cards for necessities and risk long-term debt or face immediate deprivation. These choices that had seemed abstract when discussed in policy debates became viscerally real when his own survival depended on them. The job search process revealed new layers of systematic inequality that Marcus had never understood from his position of privilege. Entry-level positions required years of experience that entry-level workers couldn't obtain. Companies used automated screening systems that eliminated qualified candidates for arbitrary reasons. Employers demanded availability for irregular schedules that made second jobs or education impossible, then complained that workers lacked loyalty and career ambition. The entire system seemed designed to keep desperate people competing against each other rather than demanding better working conditions. Meanwhile, Marcus's billionaire identity continued generating wealth through automated investment systems and passive income streams that he had established years earlier. His net worth increased by millions during the same weeks that David Miller worried about affording food and rent. The contrast between his two financial realities highlighted the absurdity of an economic system where some people's money generated more money without any labor, while other people's full-time work barely provided survival. The most painful aspect of his situation was watching his neighbors and former co-workers struggle with similar challenges, while knowing he could solve their problems instantly, but couldn't reveal his ability to help. Janet was rationing Emma's medications to make them last longer, risking her daughter's recovery to save money. Mike was working 18-hour days driving for multiple rideshare apps, sacrificing his health and relationship with Lisa to generate enough income for basic expenses. Mrs. Rodriguez was taking on additional cleaning jobs despite her arthritis, worried about her own retirement security after watching younger workers lose their benefits. These personal relationships had transformed Marcus's understanding of wealth inequality from an abstract social issue into a moral emergency that demanded immediate action. He could no longer think about economic policy in terms of market efficiency or business competitiveness when the faces of real people suffering preventable hardship haunted his conscience. The knowledge that his own business decisions had created similar suffering for thousands of families he had never met became an unbearable psychological burden. As Christmas approached and his unemployment stretched into its fourth week, Marcus realized that his experiment had succeeded beyond his original intentions. He had wanted to understand how ordinary people lived, and now he comprehended not just the practical challenges of financial insecurity, but the emotional toll of systematic powerlessness. The truth he had uncovered wasn't just about wealth inequality, but about the moral corruption of a system that treated human beings as disposable resources while concentrating unprecedented wealth among a small elite who remained isolated from the consequences of their decisions. The decision came to Marcus during a sleepless night in his 6th week of unemployment, as he listened to Mrs. Rodriguez crying softly through the thin walls after receiving an eviction notice. She had fallen behind on rent while caring for her sick grandson, and despite working multiple jobs, couldn't catch up on the accumulated debt. The sound of her quiet desperation finally broke something inside Marcus that had been holding his two identities separate. He couldn't continue the deception any longer. The moral weight of watching people he genuinely loved suffer while he possessed the resources to help them immediately had become unbearable. But more importantly, Marcus realized that his experiment had revealed truths about wealth inequality and systematic exploitation that demanded action on a much larger scale than individual charity could address. The knowledge he had gained came with an obligation to use his power and resources to challenge the very system that had made him wealthy. The next morning, Marcus called Sarah Martinez for the first time since beginning his undercover experiment. His business partner and oldest friend immediately heard the change in his voice. Not just the stress of unemployment that David Miller was experiencing, but a fundamental transformation in how Marcus understood the world and his place in it. Sarah listened in stunned silence as Marcus described his 6 months as David Miller, the relationships he had formed, and the systematic inequality he had witnessed firsthand. Sarah's initial reaction was concern for Marcus's mental health. She worried that the stress of living in poverty had traumatized him and distorted his perspective on business and economics. But as Marcus shared specific stories about his co-workers and neighbors, detailing the human cost of corporate policies they had both implemented, Sarah began to understand that his transformation was based on genuine insights rather than temporary emotional reactions. The friend she had known for 25 years was still there, but his priorities and values had been permanently changed by experiences that challenged everything they had believed about wealth success, and social responsibility. Marcus made the difficult decision to reveal his identity gradually, starting with the people who had become most important to him during his time as David Miller. He began with Mrs. Rodriguez, whose eviction crisis demanded immediate attention. Marcus knocked on her door that evening and quietly explained that he had resources to help with her financial emergency, though he couldn't immediately explain how or why. Her initial suspicion and pride made her reluctant to accept help from a neighbor she thought was unemployed, but Marcus's genuine care for her grandson convinced her to let him arrange payment of her rent debt. The conversation with Janet was even more difficult, because Emma's ongoing medical treatment created urgency that overrode concerns about propriety or pride. Marcus explained that he had access to funds that could cover all of Emma's treatment costs and ensure that Janet never had to choose between her daughter's health and their financial survival. Janet's relief was overwhelming, but she also asked questions about David Miller's sudden access to substantial resources that Marcus struggled to answer without revealing his full identity. Mike and Lisa's situation required a different approach, because their problems were structural rather than emergency-based. Marcus arranged for Lisa to receive a full scholarship to nursing school through a foundation he controlled, presenting it as an award she had earned through her academic performance and community college enrollment. For Mike, Marcus created a consulting opportunity with one of his companies that would provide stable income and benefits while allowing him to use his intelligence and people skills rather than just his driving abilities. These individual interventions felt both necessary and inadequate to Marcus. He was treating symptoms of systematic inequality rather than addressing the root causes that created poverty and insecurity for millions of families like those he had come to know. The moral imperative he felt to help his neighbors and former co-workers extended to everyone facing similar struggles throughout the country and around the world. Marcus spent weeks developing a comprehensive plan to transform his business empire in ways that would address the systematic exploitation he had witnessed. He would convert his main company from a traditional corporation to a worker-owned cooperative, giving employees ownership stakes and decision-making power over their working conditions and compensation. Manufacturing contracts would be redirected to companies that paid living wages and provided comprehensive benefits. Executive compensation would be capped at reasonable multiples of median worker pay, with excess profits distributed to employees and community development rather than shareholders. The resistance Marcus encountered from his board of directors, executive team, and investors was immediate and intense. They argued that his proposed changes would destroy shareholder value, make the company uncompetitive, and represent a betrayal of his fiduciary responsibilities. Legal challenges were threatened, and several major investors demanded his removal as CEO. The business media portrayed his transformation as a psychological breakdown or publicity stunt, rather than a serious response to moral concerns about wealth inequality. But Marcus had anticipated this resistance and spent months preparing for the legal and financial battles that would follow his decision to prioritize worker welfare over profit maximization. He had restructured his ownership stakes and established legal frameworks that protected his ability to implement changes despite shareholder opposition. More importantly, his experience living as David Miller had given him a moral certainty about the rightness of his actions that couldn't be shaken by business school arguments about market efficiency. The most painful aspect of Marcus's transformation was the reaction from his wealthy peers and former friends. People who had celebrated his business success now treated him as a traitor to his class who was undermining the economic system that had enriched them all. Social invitations disappeared, business relationships ended, and longtime friends accused him of virtue signaling and political grandstanding. The isolation he experienced reminded him of his loneliness before the experiment, but now it felt like a consequence of moral choice rather than emotional emptiness. The revelation of Marcus's true identity to his neighbors and former co-workers created complex emotions that took months to resolve. Some felt betrayed by his deception, angry that he had observed their struggles while possessing the power to help but choosing to maintain his disguise. Others understood his need to experience their reality firsthand and appreciated that his subsequent actions demonstrated genuine commitment to addressing the problems he had witnessed. The relationships that survived were deeper and more honest than before, based on shared understanding of inequality and mutual commitment to social justice. Marcus's story became public when investigative journalists connected David Miller's employment records with Marcus Chen's sudden transformation into a social justice advocate. The media attention was intense and largely negative, with conservative commentators condemning his business changes as destructive to American capitalism and liberal critics dismissing his actions as insufficient given the vast wealth he retained. The complexity of his experience and motivations was reduced to simple narratives that missed the profound personal transformation he had undergone. Despite the criticism and challenges, Marcus continued implementing changes that prioritized human welfare over profit maximization. His company's worker-owned structure became a model for other businesses interested in more equitable compensation and decision-making. The foundation he established focused on systematic change rather than charitable band-aids, supporting policy research, community organizing, and worker advocacy that addressed root causes of inequality rather than just symptoms. The most lasting impact of Marcus's experiment was his understanding that wealth inequality wasn't a natural phenomenon, but a policy choice that could be changed through different decisions by people in positions of power. His experience as David Miller had shown him that ordinary people possessed wisdom, resilience, and community bonds that wealthy elites had lost in their pursuit of individual success. The truth he had uncovered was indeed too painful to bear unchanged, but it was also too important to ignore. Years later, Marcus reflected that his 6 months as David Miller had taught him more about business economics and human nature than his previous 25 years as a billionaire. The relationships he had formed with Mrs. Rodriguez, Janet, Mike, Lisa, and his other neighbors remained central to his life, reminding him daily of the human consequences of economic decisions. The pain of witnessing systematic exploitation had been transformed into purpose, and the wealth that had once isolated him from genuine human connection now served as a tool for creating the more just and equitable society that his experience had shown was both necessary and possible.